So this is going to be my somewhat comprehensive method of how I turn a drawing into a resin cast doll. I will show you what I do for sculpting, what I do for finishing, and what I do for mold making, as well as casting all the pieces in resin. But that's way down the line. The first step is blueprint. So you want to draw your blueprint in basically the size you want. I've made this one about 21.5 centimeters, which I've written up there. I didn't really decide on that number, I just wanted it to be about 20 centimeters was what I wanted for this doll. I've been doing a lot of tiny dolls with my little Louis and George, and I have my June, who's a little bigger, but I never made a proper blueprint for them, so it's a bit more of a challenge for them because I'm just kind of going in blind and fussing with things. I definitely recommend making a blueprint and drawing one out, figuring out where you want the joints and how you want the joints to basically sit. You can always change your mind on this stuff later. I have made this very ambitious in having so many joints, very inspired by Doll Chateau with the multiple joints on the wrists and stuff. But I don't know if I'll actually do that at the end, but this blueprint will at least, if I do decide to do that, it is there and I can use that to help mark off where I want to cut. So, with the blueprint, you have it all written down how you want. How I go for drawing the blueprint is I do the front facing first. So I figure out, okay, what do I want this guy to look like? In this case, I wanted him to be very kind of thin and spindly. Not too thin and spindly because I don't want too small of pieces to cast, but those elbows and knees are going to be fun to cast as it was for those guys, but I've worked it out mostly for doing that kind of tiny stuff. But once I get the front done, I then do the side by marking out lines. As you probably can faintly see here, the lines, I use a ruler and just drew a straight line for the joints and like where things lay so I can, you know, have it match up as perfectly as I possibly can. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, it just has to be close enough that a slight difference isn't going to completely offset the entire thing. I use the blueprint more as a guideline than a direct do this exactly. But you're welcome to copy it exactly. It depends how fiddly you want to get with the details of this. But if you are going to copy it exactly, make sure you measure things and stuff. Like, I'm pretty sure this guy has one arm that's longer than the other in the drawing, but that's fine because I can just use one to use for measuring and work it out from there. This just gives me a general idea of how I want it to look, just front and side. You can also do a back and the other side, depending on how asymmetrical your character is going to be. But this one, he's going to be fairly symmetrical, so I just did the front and one side. And that's the blueprint. With that blueprint, you then want to build up a core. And the core basically is something that the clay that you sculpt on top sits over so you don't waste as much clay and it's easier to drill and clean out afterwards. So for this guy, because his limbs are very thin, I'm not going to worry about them. I will just drill them after because I don't really have anything that will work for how I'm doing it. I may invest in some like metal skewers or something down the line, but because I use Sculpey, which is a polymer clay, it's oven baked, so it has to be something that can go in the oven. I have straws, which are fine because the temperature isn't hot enough to melt them, and aluminum foil for my core. If you're using air dry clay, you're a lot more free and open to use different things, like you can use styrofoam, you can use paper, you can use pretty much anything, as long as you put something between it, like plastic wrap or aluminum foil, to prevent the clay from sticking too firmly to it. I found with paper clay, when I did use it, because I did dabble slightly in it, but I didn't personally enjoy it. It's a wet clay, so you don't really want to put paper directly on it, or it will just stick to it and it completely makes it a bit more of a mess. But use plastic wrap, aluminum foil, But you can use like paper as like making balls and then wrap it in plastic wrap to save on plastic, because plastic is not recyclable, at least not plastic wrap. Now, with all of that out of the way, I'm going to start forming the core of this guy, who I haven't quite given a name yet. So if you do have a name suggestion, you can feel free to let me know, either on Instagram, which is Wolfina5, or here on YouTube. Some straws. These straws are just like I got at the thrift store because they just pack everything up in bags, and there was something else in the bag I wanted, and I don't remember what that is now, but I got a bunch of straws. That might work very nicely. So what I'm going to use this for is just basically the straw I'm basically going to use to, little friend here. He's very curious of what I'm doing. But yes, I'm going to use the straw. I'm going to cut basically right here. Are you helping, Merlin? So that's going to be the start of my core, but it's not going to be the finish. I'm going to add more to it. I think that'll do for my core. As I mentioned, I'm not going to do the arms and legs because they're too thin. I would run into problems with it, because I'm using Sculpey, so it's a little more brittle and crumbly the smaller you go. I'd much rather do those solid and then drill them after. But with this done, we can now move on to the actual sculpting, which is the most exciting part. So again, I use Sculpey. This is the stuff I use. I just bought this at Michael's. It was 20 bucks because I had a coupon. There's a lot, and it's just white. I keep like a little bit in this bag here, just a little Ziploc, just so I don't have to keep my box out. I can just put it away and then only have the small out that I need. So what we do now is we sculpt on top of our core. Simple enough. You don't, for this first pass, you don't need to make it detailed and perfect. You're just covering the core. You're making sure that there is nothing showing and that you have not too thin but not too thick of a covering. So you want it to be basically the same shape here, but you also don't want it too thin where it's going to just flake off after you bake it or wait for it to dry, depending on the type of pie. So what I'm going to do here is, I've basically kind of worked out what the rough form. I'm just going to keep adding to it to make it as close to this blueprint as I can. I'm just going to have little marks here to mark where I need to add more clay. And that's just so I know where I should add and not overshoot it. You always can remove clay. This is just basically clay on top of the form, so You just add, remove until you're happy with the basic shape. A lot of questions I see online are, what should I use to sculpt? As I mentioned before, I use Sculpey, and as you can see, most artists I know and see doing it use air dry clay. Ladal clay is what I see a lot. It really depends what you're most comfortable using. If you enjoy using air dry clay, then use it. If you enjoy using polymer clay, then use it. I felt like when I first started that I had to use air dry clay, so I bought myself a big little bag, like little package of air dry clay, and I was like, well, I don't want to just waste this. I don't want to like make something and waste it. So I just kind of sat on it for like a few months, and then eventually I was like, I really want to sculpt something, but I'm not ready to bust out that air dry clay, so I'm going to grab my polymer clay that I'm really familiar using, because I used to like make little charms in high school and the like. And I spent half a day just sculpting away, and I made a small little prototype of my little George. It wasn't this guy. This was like iteration like 5 or 6. I did a lot of back and forth and replaced so many pieces and basically redid it like 5 times over. But it was all incremental. It wasn't like I redid the entire thing over and over again. It was basically I sculpted the whole thing in half a day. None of the joints worked. He could move his arms around, but it couldn't hold a pose to save his life. I was a little disappointed by that, but I was still proud because it looked like a ball jointed doll as far as like I was familiar with, because at the time I didn't own any ball jointed dolls. I just kind of was going off of images and things I seen online about them. I planned on getting a ball jointed doll, and I was waiting on it. And that was the main reason I wasn't going to use air dry clay too, is that I didn't have a ball jointed doll to really reference or work from to figure out how joints work. But it turns out you don't really need that in order to figure things out. You can trial and error it. It's a lot more work, and it's a lot more, you know, a lot more risky. But you can still do that. A bit more polymer clay. Not risky, but just you will end up wasting a bit more materials if you don't have an idea of how joints work. I plan on going over, once we get to that point here, how joints work. So hopefully, even if you don't own the ball jointed doll, this will help you figure out how to sit the joints and work them out. At least from my own trial and error in doing things. Alright, he's finished baking, and I also added another layer to kind of thin out any bumps and divots in it, just to make it a bit more uniform. So he may look a little less spindly than last time. But I'm really happy with how his shape looks right now. It's not perfect. There's still lots of things that need to be sanded out and cleaned, but sanding will come. I don't usually do sanding too much. If I do sanding, I don't do much at this phase. This phase is mostly just about blocking out and getting the general shape. I've worked on his head a little bit, so it's a bit more of a head shape. But the first pass, when I stopped filming, was where I baked it, and then after it finished cooling from baking, I then added another layer of clay to thin out some pieces and better define the shape. And now, we're at the stage of cutting. Before we cut, we have to mark off where we want to cut. So in the case here, I want to line up the pieces with the drawing I've done here and mark off with a pencil just where I want to cut. So I'll start with the easy spots, which are the shoulders and hips. You just want to draw a line around like so. Very simple. So how I do with the marks is that I go to one side and add a little bit, and then I go to the other side and add a little bit. And that way I can make sure that it meets in the middle, and rather than end up with like, oh, like that, like, you know, like a wonky circle. And there we go. Everything is marked out where I want to cut. So we got all the arm joints, we got all the leg joints. So, next we'll have to talk about safety. It is next part. I'm going to be using a Dremel, so safety equipment is a must. You don't have to use a Dremel, or a rotary tool rather is the proper name for it. You can use a hacksaw. These are $10. If you are cutting it apart, use a hacksaw. I see a lot of people using like fucking craft knives and like woodworking tools. You can do that, but it's dangerous. You're gonna cut yourself. I have cut myself way too many times to let people cut themselves. Go to the hardware store, get yourself a hacksaw, get yourself some safety gloves. These are important when you're doing cutting and cutting for mods. Even for fashion dolls, you have to keep safe. I have cut myself too many times, and I am happy I haven't lost any fingers. Now, as well with a glove and a hacksaw, or in my case, I'm going to use it. Oops. In my case, I'm going to use a Dremel. You also should get, if you're using a Dremel especially, safety glasses and a dust mask. You want to protect your lungs. It's very important. It doesn't have to be a fancy one like I had. You can just use like a fabric one, you know, like everyone has right now, a fabric mask for current events. You can just use that to use for the Dremel. It's just to prevent dust particles. I use a N95 for dust, but a cloth mask will work to prevent dust particles. If you're using MSC or sealant, you do need a more protective mask because it is a vapor rather than dust. Next, I got this at the dollar store. It was $3. It's just a cutting board, so I don't ruin my desk table any more than it already is. That's all that. So the next little bit will just be sound, like I'll probably put music or something and time lapse it because I'll just be cutting this and it'll be loud because the Dremel's loud. I'll pause it if I think of anything to add. The main thing is you don't just cut straight through. With polymer clay here, especially, it gets crumbly when you cut through it. You want to take it bit by bit, so I tend to go like around as I cut, and that's just to make sure that nothing breaks or splits. If it does crack or split, you can just patch it up with more polymer clay and pop it in the oven and bake it again, but you want to kind of prevent that as much as you can and get a clean cut as you can. So I'm going to put on my mask and we'll get cutting. I didn't go quite all the way through for it, but that's because you can just break it apart when you only have tiny bits left. Alright, so that's all those pieces taken care of. I'm going to show a little bit with using a hacksaw and how you do it. Now, you do it kind of the same way. Just saw into it bit by bit, turning it and getting, basically trying to make a tiny bit in the middle that you can just break apart easy. I'm not as good as with a hacksaw as I am with the Dremel. You just keep working on it. Take it slow. It's not a race. much as you want to get it done as fast as possible, it's better to do things slowly and right than fast and wrong. There you go. That's how you'd use the hacksaw to cut off. Same way, it's just a different tool. Oops. Oh, I can fix that later. Alright, that's all those pieces apart. I'll make sure that... Now, at this point, I would recommend grabbing your pencil again, and we will mark here. So this is the left. You just mark on here L and R for left and right on all the pieces, just so you don't mix them up, because I definitely have. And this just makes sure that you know which piece is which, so you don't have to end up redoing something. You can also add that it's the arms or legs if you want, but I should be fine with just left and right personally. But if you're worried about mixing up the arms and leg pieces because they're very kind of similar shaped, you can put like an A or an extra L for leg. Next thing I'm going to do is, now that we've cut the head off the body, we're going to mark off where we want the head cap to be. Now there's two different ways you can do the head cap. You can either do it as a separate cap from the head itself, or do the face is separate from the head itself. And basically you just decide where you want the neck to be. So we know this hole right here is where the neck's gonna go. So that helps us out a lot, so we can kind of use that as a guide. For this one, because I've done a lot of for these little guys, I did a lot of just the caps. I'm going to do it differently and do it where the face is removable and the cap is the non-removable piece. I have a couple dolls like that, and I find actually, especially for the smaller dolls, it's a lot easier because then you don't have to worry about the S-hook being in the way when you're putting in eyes and all that. So I recommend it for smaller dolls. If you're doing like a larger doll, you might not have to worry about it as much. So let me just add some marks in here. See where we're starting. And then we'll mark up this way. So if you want the head cap to be a face cap, basically, you mark it so that it cuts off here. If you were doing it that the cap is like these guys where it's a little... I'm not explaining this the best, but you can basically have it where it will be the head cap or the face cap. I'm doing a face cap, and you cut here and then around up here, just the same. But if it was the opposite way, where you cut here and keep this attached, then it would just be the head cap. Yes, let's... Alright, and that's that. So now we've marked out where we want to cut. It's not even, but I do a lot of the straightening up the head cap later, because I always find that it never really cuts straight for me because I still need practice. You may be asking, oh, well, how will I get that with my hacksaw? My hacksaw can't do that. This will be the one exception I can say that you can use a safety knife, but be careful. You want to be very careful with this, so you don't want to cut yourself. How I use Dremels and knives is that I have my non-dominant hand, I hold the item, I have a safety glove, and I don't have a safety glove in this hand, so I can have better control. If you're more comfortable wearing a safety glove in both, wear a safety glove in both. more safety is better safety, I say. But I find it a little easier to control this way. And it's usually the non-dominant hand that's holding the piece. I find I cut myself with, so. A good rule of thumb, if you are using just like a craft knife to kind of cut, is that if you feel like you are putting too much pressure, then you're putting too much pressure. You just want it to cut gently. You don't want to be shoving this knife in, because that's when you start slipping and cutting yourself. Just want to do tiny cuts again. Just to make sure that it's all the way through. Gently wiggle. Oh, there we go. So now we got 2 separate pieces for the head. And we just want to remove this tin foil. Tin foil, I find, because it tends to make little divots and grooves inside it, you need a little extra help. Just take it slow. Bit by bit. Oh. I took a little bit with it. That's alright. It's just a little bit. We can fix it. And there we go. Alright. I'm going to clean my desk, and I will return after a moment. Alright, so that is it for this episode. I've cleaned up my desk now, and I've got my lovely little boy here and all his pieces. The next episode, I will go over just cleaning up these pieces and drilling holes in them if they're too thin to have cores in. But that's it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed and found this informative and helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to drop a line down in the comments, or even on my Instagram. I'm always happy to answer any questions, and it might be something that's useful, and I'll include my next episode even. But I'd like to have this now. If you have a suggestion for a name for this lovely spindly boy, please drop it in the comments down below. So that's any name, as long as it's not crude or silly. Like, I don't really want a Bodie McBoatface. But yeah, go ahead and give me your suggestions. I'd love to hear any suggestions for names and any suggestions for future episodes. This is my first time uploading something to YouTube like this, and I'm very new, and obviously with my ums and ahs, you can tell that I am not very good at writing scripts. But hopefully I get a little more confident, and next few episodes will be a lot better. But thanks again for watching. Please like and subscribe, and tune in for the next episode where we work a bit more on this spindly boy.